The wagon wheel broke on a Tuesday, 3 miles outside of Cutter's Creek, and that was how Adelaide Carver's careful plans crumbled into the red Wyoming dust. She had been traveling for 11 days. 11 days of hard-packed roads and blistering summer heat, of biscuits so dry they crumbled before they reached her lips, of sleeping upright against her single trunk, because there was no room to stretch flat in the supply wagon she had hitched a ride on from Laramie. The driver, a thick-necked man named Orville Potts who smelled of rancid grease and spoke mostly in grunts, had been kind enough in his way, but when the right rear wheel split clean off its axle and sent the whole wagon lurching sideways into the ditch, his kindness dried up along with her luck. "End of the line," Orville said, not unkindly, already climbing down to survey the damage. "I got no spare wheel. Have to wait here for somebody coming back toward Laramie." "I cannot go back to Laramie," Adelaide said. "Then you are walking to Cutter's Creek," Orville said, and that was that. She stood in the July heat of 1878 with her trunk at her feet, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at it directly, and she breathed in slowly through her nose the way her mother had taught her to do when the world tried to knock you sideways. Her mother had been a practical woman. Her mother had also been dead for 3 years now, and Adelaide had been managing the collapse of one life after another ever since, so a broken wagon wheel was not going to be the thing that finished her. She left the trunk. There was nothing in it she could not live without, and she had already proven she could live without quite a lot. She kept the canvas bag over her shoulder that held her money, what was left of it, which was not much, her mother's silver hairbrush, a change of clothes, and the letter from the employment agency in Cheyenne that said there was a schoolteacher position available in Cutter's Creek, Wyoming, starting the 1st of August, and that if she arrived and proved herself able, the position was hers. She had 2 weeks. She had 3 miles. She started walking. The town of Cutter's Creek was exactly what she had expected, and nothing she had hoped for. A single main street with a saloon, a general store, a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of wooden buildings so sun-bleached they looked as though the color had simply given up and left. There were maybe 200 people in the valley, she would later learn, spread across homesteads and ranches for miles in every direction, and the town itself served as their gathering point, their post office, their source of gossip and commerce and the occasional brawl on a Saturday night. Adelaide walked into town with dust on her boots and her dark hair falling loose from its pins, and she went directly to the general store, because she had learned early that general store proprietors knew everything worth knowing in a small western town. The proprietor was a woman named Harriet Goss, wide-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with hands that had seen decades of hard work. She looked Adelaide over with the particular assessment of someone who has sized up a great many strangers and found most of them wanting. "You must be the new schoolteacher," Harriet said. "I hope to be," Adelaide said. "I am Adelaide Carver. I was told to speak with a Mr. Aldrich regarding the position." "Thomas Aldrich runs the school board," Harriet said. "He also runs the bank, the cattle association, and approximately half of this county, depending on who you ask. He is not a bad man, but he likes things his way." She paused, still looking at Adelaide with those sharp eyes. "You are younger than I expected." "I am 26, Adelaide said. "I have been teaching for 4 years. "Where?" "Kansas originally, then Colorado for 2 years. I left Colorado in April." Harriet did not ask why she had left Colorado, and Adelaide was grateful for that, because the answer was complicated and involved a man named Gerald who had promised her things that turned out to be lies, and she did not have the energy to explain it without her voice going tight in a way she hated. She had left Colorado with nothing but her trunk and her determination, and she had spent 3 months making her way toward whatever came next. "You can take a room at the Cutter's Creek boarding house," Harriet said, coming around the counter and gesturing vaguely down the street. "Mrs. Polly Fitch runs it. She will take you on credit until you have wages coming in, provided Aldrich hires you, which I suspect he will because he is desperate and the last schoolteacher left in February without notice." She paused again. "Can you actually teach, Miss Carver?" "Yes," Adelaide said simply. "I can." Something in her voice must have been convincing, because Harriet nodded once, decided, and went back behind her counter. "Supply order comes in Thursday. If you need anything before then, I will do what I can." It was the first genuine welcome Adelaide had received in longer than she cared to count, and it nearly undid her entirely, which surprised her, because she had thought she was past being undone by small kindnesses. She thanked Harriet Goss, picked up her canvas bag, and went to find the boarding house. She met Thomas Aldrich the following morning, dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark green wool that was too warm for July but made her look competent, which was worth sweating for. He was a square-jawed man in his 50s with the manner of someone who expected agreement, and he asked her a series of questions about curriculum and discipline, and her views on the education of girls versus boys, to which she gave him the answers he wanted on most counts and the honest answer on that last one, which seemed to both surprise and grudgingly impress him. He hired her on a provisional basis, told her school would resume in September, and that she had housing arranged as part of the position, a room in the boarding house through the fall. After that, she would need to sort something out herself. "You will find Cutter's Creek a good town," he said, shaking her hand in that perfunctory way of men who consider handshakes with women a slightly inconvenient formality. "People look after their own here." Adelaide smiled and thanked him and walked out into the blazing morning sun, thinking that she had heard that particular sentiment about a great many places, and it was usually only true for a carefully selected definition of their own. Still, she had a position. She had a room. She had 6 weeks before school began to learn this town and its rhythms, and she intended to use them. The first time she saw Jacob Merritt was 3 days after her arrival, and she almost walked directly into him because she was reading a letter while walking, which was a habit she knew was foolish and could not seem to stop. She rounded the corner of the general store and found herself suddenly presented with the very solid chest of a man coming the other direction, and she jerked back hard enough that she stumbled, and a hand shot out and caught her elbow before she hit the ground. "Careful," said a voice, low and unhurried. She looked up. He was tall, not excessively, but tall enough that she had to tilt her chin up, with sun-dark skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar, and eyes the particular warm brown of creek water in the last hour of afternoon light. He had the lean, capable build of someone who had worked outdoors every day of his adult life, and there was a quality of stillness about him that she found simultaneously calming and unsettling, the way a quiet stretch of river can be calming until you remember there is a current. He released her elbow the moment she was steady. "Thank you," she said. "I apologize. I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I," he said, which was generous because she suspected he probably was. He glanced at the letter in her hand, not intrusively, just a flicker of awareness, and then he touched the brim of his hat and stepped around her and continued on his way. She turned to watch him go without quite meaning to, then turned back around and walked firmly in the other direction. She asked Harriet about him that afternoon as casually as she could manage. "Jacob Merritt," Harriet said, without looking up from the bolts of fabric she was arranging, "has a cattle operation about 8 miles out. Good land, good cattle, decent-sized herd, keeps to himself mostly. Comes into town once or twice a week for supplies or business." She paused, polite enough, not given to trouble. "He seems young to have his own operation," Adelaide said. 31, Harriet said. "Took the land over from his father 4 years back when the old man died. Been building it up since. Hard worker." She looked up then, those sharp eyes amused in a way she did not try to hide. "Why, just making acquaintance with the community," Adelaide said. Harriet's expression said she believed exactly none of that, but she let it go. Adelaide saw Jacob Merritt again on Thursday, at the general store when the supply order came in, and this time he noticed her before she nearly collided with him. He was lifting a heavy crate of goods with the easy economy of someone strong enough not to make a show of it, and he paused when he saw her coming through the door, set the crate down on the counter, and gave her a nod that was just formal enough to be polite and just unhurried enough to be something more than that. "Miss Carver," he said. He had learned her name then. "Mr. Merritt," she said. She had learned his. Harriet watched this exchange from behind the counter with an expression of profound satisfaction that she was equally unsuccessful at hiding. There was no real reason for them to speak further. She was there for thread, and he was there for supplies. But somehow they ended up standing near the window at the same time, and he said, "You settling in all right?" And she said, "As well as can be expected." And he said, "Cutter's Creek takes some getting used to." And she said, "Most places do." And something about the way she said it made him look at her a little more carefully, the way you look at a landscape when you realize it is more complicated than it appeared at first glance. "You are the new school teacher," he said. "Provisionally," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. Aldrich is reserving the right to decide I am unsuitable if I do anything he disapproves of between now and September." Something shifted in his expression, amusement, maybe, or recognition. "What kind of things does he disapprove of?" "Independent thinking, chiefly," she said, and then covered her mouth briefly, because she had not intended to say that to a virtual stranger. But Jacob Merritt did not look shocked. He looked, if anything, more interested. "Good luck to him trying to stamp that out," he said quietly, and picked up his crate and went out the door. Adelaide stood by the window and watched the street outside and tried to remember what she had come in for. Thread. Right. July in Cutter's Creek was a slow burn of heat and routine. Adelaide helped Harriet Goss at the general store in the mornings, unpaid but useful, learning the town through the lens of what people bought and how they paid for it, which told you more about a community than almost anything else. She helped Polly Fitch at the boarding house in the afternoons in exchange for her rent, doing laundry and mending, and whatever other tasks needed doing. And in the evenings she sat on the boarding house porch with her lesson materials and planned for September. She saw Jacob Merritt regularly, because a rancher with a working operation came into town often enough for one reason or another, and because Cutter's Creek was small enough that seeing someone regularly was simply inevitable. They progressed slowly through the particular stages of a small-town acquaintance. The nod, the greeting, the brief exchange of pleasantries, the occasional conversation that stretched a little longer than either of them had planned for. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, a detail at a time. He had grown up on the ranch, had worked it alongside his father from the time he was old enough to be useful, had left for 2 years at 20 to work cattle drives north to Montana, and had come back to find his father ailing and the ranch struggling. He had a horse named Copperhead who was, by all accounts, mean to everyone except Jacob. He had 3 ranch hands who worked for him, and seemed to regard him with the uncomplicated loyalty of men who had been treated fairly. He read when he had time for it, which was not often, but when she mentioned a book she had brought from Laramie, he knew it, and had an opinion about it that was considered and a little unexpected. He learned things about her too, though she was more careful with what she offered. She had grown up in Missouri, moved to Kansas with her parents at 16, lost her father to a fever when she was 19 and her mother to grief-turned consumption a few years after that. She had started teaching to support herself. She had gone from Kansas to Colorado. She did not say why she had left, and he did not ask, and from Colorado to Wyoming. "You have moved around a great deal," he said one afternoon in early August, both of them sheltering from the worst of the midday heat on the shaded side of the general store, he with a cup of coffee from Harriet and she with a glass of water. "I have," she said. There was no defensiveness in it, it was just a fact. "Do you intend to stay?" She looked at the dusty street, at the crooked church steeple, at the mountains in the distance that were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also completely indifferent to you. "I intend to try," she said. "I think that is all any of us can honestly say." He was quiet for a moment. She had noticed that about him, that he was not afraid of quiet the way some men were, did not feel compelled to fill every silence with noise. "That's fair," he said. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before your family." "My father came from Tennessee," he said. "Came west after the war. My mother was from here, well, from the territory. She died when I was 7. I am sorry. It was a long time ago." He looked at his coffee. "But you do not forget." "No," Adelaide agreed softly. "You do not. The thing about that summer was that it moved the way all meaningful things move, far too quickly in hindsight, though it did not feel quick while it was happening. Every conversation felt like it was building toward something neither of them had named yet, and the not naming of it was part of what made it feel careful, deliberate, like both of them were placing their feet slowly on uncertain ground. In late August, she went out to the Merritt Ranch for the first time. It was not a planned visit. She had gone to pick up a letter from a ranch family whose eldest son would be enrolling in September, and the route took her past the Merritt property line, and Jacob happened to be working the fence along the road and looked up when he heard her horse. She had borrowed one of Polly's old mares and waved her over. The ranch was bigger than she had imagined, spread across a broad valley with the mountains behind it and a creek running through the lower pasture. She could see cattle in the distance and a modest but well-maintained barn and a cluster of outbuildings, and the house itself was a solid 2-story structure that looked like it had been built by someone who intended to stay. "It is lovely," she said, and meant it genuinely. "The land is remarkable." "I know it," he said, and there was a quiet fierceness in the way he said it, the way a person speaks about something they have poured themselves into for years. He was leaning against the fence post with his hat pushed back on his head, and the late afternoon light doing something rather unfair to the angles of his face, and Adelaide became very occupied with looking at the mountains. "Do you have everything you need out here?" she asked. "It must be a long way to come to town every time something is needed." "You get used to the distance," he said, "and it matters less when there is something worth coming to town for." She looked at him then, because the comment had a particular weight to it, and he was looking at her with that steady attention that she had come to recognize as his version of saying something he did not quite have the words for yet. She rode back to town in the golden evening light with her heart doing something complicated and inconvenient, and she spent the night firmly reminding herself that she had made poor decisions about men before, and that Jacob Merritt was, quite possibly, simply a friendly person. She was not sure she believed it, but she held on to it. September arrived and school began, and Adelaide threw herself into the work with the total commitment of someone who genuinely loved what she did. There were 22 children enrolled, ranging from 6 to 15, in a single-room schoolhouse that had been somewhat optimistically furnished and not very well maintained. She spent the week before school opened cleaning it thoroughly, repairing what she could, and arranging what could not be repaired into something that at least had the shape of order. The children were a revelation. They were, as rural children in the territory tended to be, practical and capable and somewhat skeptical of formal education, having been raised by people whose relationship with schooling was purely functional. But they were also curious, and curious was the thing Adelaide knew best how to work with. She did not try to make them love the abstract idea of learning. She made them see how it connected to the things they already cared about, the calculations in surveying land and measuring rainfall, the history in the land they lived on, the literature that reflected back something true about human lives. By the end of the first month, she had 17 of the 22 genuinely engaged, which she considered a success. The other 5 were coming along. Thomas Aldrich came to observe twice in October and left both times looking slightly uncertain in the way of a man who expected to find fault and did not quite manage it. He told her she was doing satisfactory work. She thanked him and went back to her classroom. Through September and October, she and Jacob Merritt continued their careful, accumulating acquaintance, but something had shifted slightly since that afternoon by the fence. He came into town more frequently, which she noticed but did not read too much into, and when they talked it was longer and less careful than before, the way a path becomes easier as you walk it more often. One evening in mid-October, He found her on the boarding house porch in the last of the daylight, and he sat on the porch steps because there was only the one chair, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, her family in Missouri. A cattle drive story he told with that dry, understated humor she had come to look for, the way the seasons changed the mountains. Until Polly Fitch put her head out the door and said pointedly that supper was on. And Jacob stood up and put his hat back on and said good evening, and Adelaide said good evening, and neither of them moved immediately, just standing there in the cooling air of an October evening, with the lamps beginning to come on in. The windows up and down the street. "Miss Carver," he said. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "Would you want to come to the ranch Sunday?" He said it simply, without preamble. "Nothing formal. I am building a new fence line around the east pasture this week, and it would be done by then, and I thought you might want to see the land in the autumn. It is different than the summer. You might find it worth the ride." It was transparently not really about the fence or the land, and they both knew it, and the knowing was part of what made something warm move through her chest. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He rode into town Sunday morning, and they rode out together on horses borrowed from the Merritt ranch, because Polly's old mare was not up to that kind of distance, and the Wyoming autumn was exactly what he had said, different from the summer, the light softer and more slanted, and the grasses gone gold, and the aspens brilliant yellow against the dark of the pine slopes. She understood why he wanted to show it to her. You showed people things like this when you wanted them to understand what you loved about where you were. He showed her the new fence line, which was solid and clean, and the upper pasture where he was rotating the herd, and the creek that ran cold and clear even in the dry fall. And then they sat on a flat rock above the valley and ate the lunch she had brought, bread and hard cheese and dried apples, and a small flask of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and talked in the easy way that she had been building toward all summer, the kind of talking that is really about listening. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Going somewhere else?" "No," he said without hesitating. "This is mine. The land was my father's before it was mine, and I put 4 years of my own blood into it." He paused. "Do you think about leaving?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley spread below them, gold and green and impossibly wide. "I think about what it would mean to stop leaving," she said carefully. "I have been moving for 7 years. I think I have forgotten what it feels like not to be about to go somewhere." "What would make you want to stop?" he asked. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, giving her the question without pressure. "I think you would need to find the thing worth staying for," she said, "and be sure you were right about it." He was quiet after that, and she was too, and the autumn wind moved through the aspens below them and made a sound like distant water. She had been in Cutter's Creek for 4 months when the first real trouble came, and it came not from outlaws or weather or any of the dramatic sources that the dime novels like to use, but from the far more ordinary source of gossip and small-town morality. Someone, she suspected she knew who, a pinch-faced woman named Meredith Cole, who attended the church with the dedication of someone keeping score, had mentioned to Thomas Aldrich that Adelaide Carver had been seen riding alone with Jacob Merritt on a Sunday, and this was apparently sufficient cause for a formal conversation. Aldrich called her into his office on a Monday morning in November with the manner of a man performing an unpleasant duty, and told her that the school board had expectations regarding the conduct of the schoolteacher, and that appearances mattered in a community like this one, and that he was sure she understood. Adelaide sat across from him in her best wool dress and her most composed expression, and understood perfectly, and also found the entire situation profoundly irritating. She was 26 years old and a professional woman, and she had done nothing improper, and the fact that she had to sit here and be counseled about it by a man whose own behavior she had heard questioned in quieter circles was, well, it was simply the world she lived in, and she had long since made peace with that fact while not making peace with the injustice of it. "I appreciate the board's concern," she said, with careful precision. "I have conducted myself appropriately in all things and intend to continue doing so." Aldrich seemed satisfied with that, or at least satisfied that the conversation had happened, and she left his office and walked back to the schoolhouse and sat at her desk for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, breathing slowly. Then she picked up her lesson materials and went on with her day. She told Jacob about it that week, not specifically seeking sympathy, but because it seemed like something he should know, and because she found that she wanted to tell him things. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am sorry, that is not right." "No," she agreed, "it is not, but it is also not surprising." "Does it change things?" he asked. "What you want to do about—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing his words with care. "About spending time together." She looked at him steadily. "I did not leave Colorado to come here and start running from other people's opinions," she said. "I am done with that." Something in his expression shifted, and it was the most openly he had looked at her yet, that guarded quality he carried lifting for just a moment. "All right," he said quietly. "Good." They were more circumspect after that, not because they were ashamed, but because they were both practical people, and a schoolteacher's position in 1878, Wyoming, was genuinely contingent on the approval of men like Thomas Aldrich, and Adelaide needed the income and was not willing to sacrifice it. They met in town rather than riding alone. They kept their conversations public, and Jacob began attending Sunday church services for the first time in what Harriet Goss privately told Adelaide was probably several years, which caused almost as much comment as the writing had. "He is courting you properly," Harriet told her, with the satisfied air of someone watching a plan come together, though she had not made any plan that Adelaide was aware of. "Jacob Merritt has not looked at a woman in Cutter's Creek since he came back from those cattle drives. Not that there have not been women who looked at him." Adelaide absorbed this with what she hoped was equanimity. "He is a good man," Harriet added, more seriously. "I have known him since he was a boy. He is honest and he works hard and he does not make promises he cannot keep, which is rarer than it ought to be." "I know," Adelaide said quietly. "Do you?" Harriet said. "Then stop acting like knowing is the same as trusting." Adelaide thought about that for a long time. The November rain came and made the roads into mud and cut the regular supply runs down to essentials, and the town pulled inward the way small western settlements did in the shoulder seasons, people spending more time close to home and less in town, and Adelaide threw herself into the school with renewed focus, because it was the thing she could control when other things felt uncertain. Jacob came to town when the weather permitted, which was not as often as before, and on the days when she went to the general store and he was not there, she noticed the absence in a way she found somewhat alarming. She was not a woman who made a habit of depending on people. She had spent 7 years being very careful not to. But she was beginning to think that maybe careful was not the only way to be. Maybe there was a version of trust that was not recklessness, that was just seeing someone clearly enough, over enough time, to believe what you saw. It was in late November that Jacob Merritt asked her to dinner formally, with his hat in his hands, and the particular slightly awkward solemnity of a man who has prepared what he means to say and is very earnestly saying it. He had ridden in on a gray afternoon specifically for this purpose. She could tell, because he was wearing a clean shirt and he had clearly made an effort with his appearance, which touched her more than she was prepared for. "I would like to take you to dinner at the hotel," he said. The hotel was the one establishment in Cutter's Creek that served meals, and it served them adequately, and it was the most public venue the town offered, which was surely the point. "Saturday evening, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. She wore the dark green wool dress again, which was her only good dress, and she put her hair up properly and borrowed a better shawl from Polly Fitch, who gave it to her with enormous quiet delight. And they sat across from each other in the small hotel dining room and ate beef and potatoes and bread and talked for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time passing. And at the end of the evening he walked her back to the boarding house, and they stood on the porch, and he said he had very much enjoyed himself. And she said she had too, and he asked if he might call on her again, and she said yes. He smiled at that, really smiled. Not the small contained thing she had been seeing all these months, but something open and warm and genuine that changed the whole architecture of his face. And she decided that Harriet Goss was right about trusting what you could clearly see. And she decided it with a certainty that felt like ground under her feet after a long time of mud. December came to the Wyoming territory like a closing door. The snow arrived early and stayed, and the mountains disappeared behind clouds for days at a time, and the wind came howling down from the north with a conviction that made the buildings shudder. Adelaide had been through cold winters before, but Wyoming cold was a different species. It had a weight to it, an insistence, as though the cold intended to be taken seriously. Jacob came into town twice a week without fail through the first part of December, which she knew was not strictly necessary for his ranch operations, because Harriet told her what was a normal winter supply schedule for a ranch 8 miles out, and twice a week was not it. He came because she was there, and he came because they had begun to be necessary to each other in the quiet way that happened when two careful people finally decided to stop being so careful. They had dinner at the hotel 3 more times in December. He brought her a book from Laramie when he went to pick up medical supplies for one of his ranch hands, a collected volume of poems by Emily Dickinson that had been published a few years before, and she read it in 2 evenings, and they talked about it for an hour, and she found that he had more to say about poetry than she would have guessed, and she added this to the ongoing accumulation of things she knew about him that she had not expected and found she very much liked. Christmas in Cutter's Creek was a community affair, a gathering at the church that Adelaide organized a small children's performance for, her pupils reciting and singing with the particular charming combination of pride and terror that characterized children performing for their parents. She stood at the back of the church afterward and watched Jacob Merritt talking to the parents of some of her students, easy and unhurried, and she thought about how much she liked watching him in his own world, with the people who had known him for years. He found her after, when most of the congregation had moved on toward the social supper at the Goss house. "You did something remarkable with those children," he said. "They did it themselves," she said. "I just arranged the conditions." "That is what teaching is, isn't it?" he said. "Arranging the conditions." She looked at him. "You are more perceptive than people probably expect," she said. "People have low expectations of cattle ranchers," he said, and she laughed, and he smiled at that laugh, at the ease of it, like he had been working toward that particular sound for a long time. "Adelaide," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded careful and deliberate in his mouth, like something he had been saving. "I want to say something to you." "Then say it," she said softly. The church was emptying around them, lamplight and cold air coming through the open door, and he stood with his hat in both hands and looked at her with that directness that she had never been able to quite look away from. "I am not a man who does things halfway," he said. "When I decided to build this ranch up, I committed to it completely. When I make a promise, I keep it. And I want you to know that what I feel about you is not casual. It is not a passing thing. I have been around long enough to know the difference." He paused. "I know you have reasons to be careful about this. I know you came here from somewhere and whatever happened there made you cautious. I'm not asking you to explain any of it. I'm just asking you to know that I am in earnest." The church was nearly empty now, just the two of them in the lamplight, and the cold coming in through the open door behind him made the candles shiver. "I know you are," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "And I want you to know that I am, that this is not casual for me either, that I am also in earnest." She stopped, then made herself continue. "I left Colorado because a man there told me he loved me and asked me to stay, and everything he said turned out to be false. I came here with nothing, and I have been very careful since because I did not want to make the same mistake." She looked at him directly. "But I do not think you are a mistake." He crossed the small distance between them and took her hand and held it, and that was all, just that simple thing, his hand around hers in the lamplight of a church on Christmas evening in 1878, and it was the first time she had felt completely steady in longer than she could remember. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not just for the school, stay." "Yes," she said, "I intend to." January and February were the deep months, the months when Wyoming showed you what it really thought of human beings and their plans. The snow came up to the windowsills of the boarding house, and the road to the Merritt Ranch was impassable for days at a stretch. And Adelaide spent those long indoor days teaching and planning, and exchanging letters with Jacob by way of whoever happened to be traveling the road between town and the ranch. His letters were not flowery. They were the letters of a man who chose words deliberately, and meant everyone he put down reports from the ranch, yes, but also the things he was thinking about, the books he was reading, the way the snow lay differently across the east pasture than the west, the way Copperhead had managed to get into the barn storage and eaten half a sack of oats, and was being aggressively unrepentant about it. She read them at her desk in the evenings with a lamp burning and something warm and settled in her chest. She wrote back with equal honesty about the children, about a disagreement with Thomas Aldrich over the curriculum for the older students that she had not yet resolved, about the way she sometimes lay awake listening to the wind and thought about the fact that she had not been this settled in one place in 7 years, and what that meant, and how strange and good it was. When the weather cleared enough for travel, he came to town. When it was too bad for that, the letters went back and forth. And through those long winter months, what had been building between them became something solid and clear, the way water clarifies after a storm. In March, when the first real thaw came and the world emerged from under the snow looking damp and cautious and renewed, Jacob Merritt asked Adelaide Carver to walk with him after church, and they walked to the edge of town where the road opened up toward the mountains, and he told her he was in love with her. He said it simply, the way he said everything, directly, without ornamentation, with that quality of certainty that she had come to depend on. He said he had been in love with her for longer than he had admitted to himself, and that he wanted to ask her to marry him, and that he wanted to be honest about what he was asking her to come into, which meant he needed to tell her some things. "The ranch is doing well," he said. "The herd is good and the land is solid, and I am building towards something that will last, but it is not easy living. It is 8 miles from town, and the winters are hard, and the nearest real city is Cheyenne, and that is a day's ride. The house is comfortable, but it is not grand." He looked at her. "I want you to know all of it before you answer." "Tell me about the house," she said. "Do you want to know? How many rooms?" "Main room and kitchen together, 1 bedroom, a small loft upstairs that could be made into another room. The cabin part is small," he said. "I have been meaning to add to it, but I have not had the time yet." She thought about the places she had lived. The 2-room house in Missouri where she had grown up with her parents and whatever else life brought through. The tiny Kansas schoolhouse where she had lived in the back room for a winter because she had nowhere else to go. The single rented room in Colorado, where she had spent a year believing a man who was lying to her about everything. The boarding house room now, which was adequate and not much more. "I have lived in smaller," she said. Something crossed his face, relief and tenderness, and something else she could not quite name except that it made her want to hold on to it. "Stay," he said. "Adelaide, stay with me." "Yes," she said, for the second time, and this time it meant everything. They were married in May, at the church with the crooked steeple, on a day when the Wyoming spring was doing its absolute best. The air clean and bright, the meadow grasses impossibly green, the mountains showing clear and sharp against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Harriet Goss stood up on Adelaide's side, and Jacob's head ranch hand, a steady older man named Francis Webb who had worked the Merritt Ranch for 8 years, stood up on his. Thomas Aldrich attended with his wife, and seemed, in the face of the genuine warmth of the occasion, to have softened somewhat in his assessment of Adelaide Carver, though she did not adjust her curriculum based on this softening. Polly Fitch made a cake with dried fruit and called it a wedding cake, and the whole town came in the way that small western towns do for a wedding. because a wedding was one of the things that knit a community together, and people understood that even if they could not have articulated it. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico that Harriet had ordered specially, and Jacob wore his good clothes and looked uncomfortable in them for about 10 minutes, and then forgot he was wearing them, and they stood in front of Pastor Williams and said what needed to be said, and Adelaide felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ranch house was exactly what Jacob had told her it was. The main room and kitchen combined into a single low-ceilinged space with a good stone fireplace and a sturdy table and chairs that Jacob had made himself over the past winter, and one bedroom with a window that faced east toward the mountains. The small loft upstairs was accessible by a narrow ladder and held stored items and the particular smell of old wood and accumulated years. Outside there was the barn and the outbuildings and the long sweep of the valley that she loved unreservedly, the creek in the lower pasture, the aspens on the slope behind the house. She found she loved it. All of it, the smallness of the house and the bigness of the land, the particular rhythm of ranch life that was so different from anything she had known before, the mornings that started before dawn and the evenings that fell on you suddenly after the last of the day's work was done. She found she loved the physicality of it, the directness, the way everything had a purpose and everything required your full attention. She did not give up the school. They had discussed this before the wedding, and Jacob had been, from the beginning, completely in support of it. "You are a teacher," he said simply. "That is what you do. The school needs you and you love it. Why would I ask you to stop?" She had looked at him steadily when he said that, and loved him specifically and additionally for it. She rode into town every school day, a journey she made alone or occasionally in Jacob's company when his route took him in that direction, and she taught her 22 children with the same commitment as before, and she came home in the evenings to a hot meal that she and Jacob prepared together. He was a better cook than she had expected, and she was more practical in the kitchen than anyone who saw her schoolteacher composure might have guessed, and they sat across from each other at the table he had made and talked about their days. The life they built was not effortless. Nothing real is. There were hard months financially in the first summer when a section of the fence line failed, and they lost some cattle and had to spend money they had earmarked for expanding the house. There was a disagreement with Thomas Aldrich in October of their first married year that almost cost Adelaide her position, over her insistence on teaching the older girls the same mathematical curriculum as the boys, which Aldrich considered unnecessary, and she considered essential, and she held her ground with careful firmness, and the support of enough parents that Aldrich eventually backed down, though he did it ungraciously. There was a bad winter in January of 1880, cold that went down past anything the old-timers said they remembered, and they lost a dozen head of cattle, and Francis Webb broke his arm, and Jacob was out in it every day, while Adelaide kept the house warm and kept the accounts, and rode into town and back through conditions that would have stopped most people, because the children needed school and she needed to be there. They argued sometimes, not often but sometimes, about small things that were really about big things, the way all married people do. He was sometimes more contained than she needed, shutting away something difficult and carrying it alone out of a habit she understood but found painful. She was sometimes too brisk with difficulty, too quick to move past it without sitting with it long enough, another habit born of years of managing alone. They were learning each other's patterns and working around them and through them, and this was the real work of a marriage, the daily slow work of becoming people who fit together not by accident but by effort. But there were also evenings in the summer when the work was done and the heat had broken, and they sat on the porch he had added to the front of the house in April of their first married year. His wedding gift to her, he said, because she had mentioned once that she liked to sit outside in the evenings and watch the last light leave the mountains, and she thought, with a clarity and peace that she had not known was available to her, that she was home. In the spring of 1880, Adelaide realized she was expecting a child. She told Jacob on a Sunday morning in April, in the kitchen, with the coffee between them and the window letting in the clean spring light. She said it simply, watching his face, and watched him go very still, and then something in him opened up like a door and he put down his cup and came around the table and just held her for a long time. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "Yes," she said honestly. "Some, are you?" "Yes," he said, "some, but mostly I am." He stopped and she could feel him searching for it. "I am glad," he said. "Adelaide, I am so glad." She held on tighter. "So am I," she said. The pregnancy changed the rhythms of their life gradually. She continued teaching through the summer and into the fall, and she was, as she had always been, practical about it. Women on the frontier worked through their pregnancies because there was no alternative, and she did not see her situation as different except that she paid closer attention to the things she carried and the roads she rode and the cold, which came early that year. She added a second horse to her roster, a steadier animal than the one she had been riding, and Jacob began riding with her into town more mornings than before. The baby, a son, born in November of 1880, came into the world in the bedroom of the ranch house with the help of the doctor from Cutter's Creek and Harriet Goss, who had delivered a great many babies in her long years and was a calming presence. Jacob sat outside the bedroom door through the labor, and Adelaide could hear him very clearly through the wall, which told her he was not as calm as he appeared to be, and she found this simultaneously exasperating and deeply endearing. When it was over and the doctor opened the door and said it was a boy and both mother and child were well, Adelaide heard Jacob exhale in a way that was more like a whole body unspooling, and Harriet opened the door wide and brought him in, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, with an expression she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They named the boy Thomas, not after Aldrich, though the coincidence would cause the real Thomas Aldrich a faint, pleased bewilderment, but after Adelaide's father, who had been a good man, Thomas Henry Merritt. He was, from the first, a person of considerable opinion and enormous appetite, which the doctor said was a very good sign. The ranch house, which had been small before, became genuinely intimate with a baby in it, and Jacob started making real plans for the addition he had been meaning to build for years. Through the winter of 1880 and the spring of 1881, with Francis Webb's help and the help of a neighbor, a lean and quiet man named Edwin Park who ran cattle on the adjacent land, they added 2 rooms to the north side of the house, a proper bedroom that gave the original bedroom to Thomas, and a small sitting room that Adelaide had not asked for but that Jacob had built, because he had noticed she sometimes took her lesson materials into the bedroom to have a quiet space to work. And he wanted her to have a room that was just for thinking. She walked through the completed addition on a May evening in 1881 with the spring light coming through the new windows and Thomas on her hip, and Jacob leaning in the doorway watching her face the way he always watched to see what she really thought. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it entirely. "Jacob, it is perfect." He crossed the room and took Thomas from her so she could move freely, and the baby immediately grabbed a fistful of his father's shirt with the single-minded determination that characterized everything he did. "You said the cabin was small," Jacob said. "I said I had lived in smaller," she said, "which is true. But this," she turned around in the new sitting room, looking at the walls he had built, the window he had placed exactly where the light would be best for reading in the afternoon. "This is not small. This is home." He looked at her over Thomas's head with that particular look, the one she had first seen on that evening in the empty church at Christmas, the one that had nothing contained about it. Thomas, unimpressed by the moment, loudly requested supper. In 1882, Adelaide experienced what she might have called, privately, the hardest and best year. The school enrollment grew to 30 children that September, a testament to the continued growth of the valley's population as new families arrived from the east and south, drawn by the land and the possibility of it. Adelaide lobbied Thomas Aldrich for a second teacher and a second classroom, and after a campaign that involved organized petitioning from parents across the valley and a 2-hour meeting that she suspected Aldrich would have preferred to avoid, she got it. A young woman named Grace Potter, fresh from a teacher's college in Ohio, who arrived in August and was terrified of everything for about 2 weeks and then settled into herself and turned out to be an excellent teacher and eventually a genuine friend. The hard part of 1882 was that Frances Webb, who had been with the ranch since Jacob's father's time, took ill in July with something that started as a summer fever and did not improve the way it should have. And through August and September, Jacob divided himself between the ranch work and sitting with Frances in the evenings, reading to him or just being there, because Frances had no family in the territory and a man ought not to be sick and alone. Frances died in October quietly in his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, and Jacob was there when it happened and came back to the house in the gray dawn light and sat at the kitchen table without speaking while Adelaide made coffee and sat across from him and waited. "He taught me most of what I know about cattle," Jacob said finally. "When my father was sick and couldn't work, Francis just kept it going. He kept all of it going." "I know," Adelaide said. "I don't know what the ranch would have looked like without him. I don't know if I would have been able to hold on to it." "You would have found a way," she said, "but I am glad you didn't have to. And I am glad he knew before he died what the ranch has become. He saw it." Jacob was quiet again, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Thank you for being here," he said. "I am always here," she said. "That is what I told you." They buried Frances Webb in the small cemetery outside Cutter's Creek, and Jacob paid for the headstone himself and made sure it said the man's full name and the dates correctly, because he said that was the least a person deserved. By the spring of 1883, the Merritt Ranch had grown to something that could legitimately be called prosperous. Jacob had expanded the herd steadily over the years, had improved the grazing land, had built a reputation for sound cattle that got him a better price at the market in Cheyenne. He hired 2 new ranch hands, a young man named Carlisle who had come up from Texas and was earnest and capable, and an older man named Reeves who did not talk much but worked harder than anyone Adelaide had ever seen. The valley itself was filling in, more homesteads established, the town of Cutter's Creek growing, a second saloon and a new dry goods store, and talk of eventually getting a proper railroad spur from Laramie. Adelaide had been at the school for 5 years now, and it showed in the way the community talked about it. People called it, with quiet pride, the best school between Laramie and the Montana border, which was perhaps an overstatement but not without a basis. She had fought for it systematically, for the resources, for the curriculum, for the dignity of every child in that room regardless of where their family came from or how much money they had, and the school reflected that fighting. She had made it a point, specifically, to make sure the children of the few Mexican families who had settled in the valley and the children of a handful of other backgrounds felt as present and worthwhile in that classroom as anyone else. The territory was full of people who treated this as a radical idea, and she understood the currents she was swimming against, and she swam against them with calm persistence. Thomas, at 3 years old, was showing signs of having inherited his mother's determination and his father's patience, and the combined opinion-having tendencies of both, which made him an extremely interesting small person to be around. He had his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a way of studying new things with a focused intensity that made Jacob say, every time he saw it, "He is going to be a reader," with a particular fondness. In the summer of 1883, Adelaide discovered she was expecting their second child. This pregnancy was different from the first, easier in some ways, heavier in others, the way second pregnancies tend to be when you know what you are getting into. She was still teaching through September and into October, as she had with Thomas, but she was also more tired and more aware of the limits of what her body would tolerate. And she was, for the first time in her life, in a position where she had someone actively making sure she did not push past those limits. Jacob was, without making a production of it, present in a way that she found simultaneously touching and occasionally frustrating, because she was a woman who had managed alone for a very long time, and being managed, even gently, required adjustment. But he was also perceptive enough to know when to step back and when to step forward, which was more than most men would have managed. "You are worrying," she told him one evening in October, watching him watch her across the dinner table. "I am thinking," he said. "You are worrying," she repeated. "Your thinking face and your worrying face are different. I know them both." He accepted this without argument. "Is it visible?" "Only to me." "Good," he said, and then after a moment, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "I am tired and I am large and I want the winter to be over before it has started, but I am fine." "Grace can manage the school if you need to stop earlier than you planned." "I know she can," Adelaide said. "I am not stopping yet." He nodded. He knew better than to push. "Thomas asked me today where the baby was going to sleep," he said, shifting the topic with a care she recognized. "He is very concerned about the logistics." "What did you tell him?" "I told him we would sort it out." "He did not find this as reassuring as I hoped." Adelaide smiled. "He would like a specific answer." "Yes," Jacob said. "He is very much like his mother in that way." She laughed, and he smiled at the sound of it. And Thomas came in from wherever he had been and inserted himself into the evening, with the 3-year-old's complete indifference to whatever conversation had been in progress before his arrival. The second baby came in January of 1884, a girl this time, born on a night when the snow was doing something particularly theatrical outside, and the fireplace was going full bore, and Harriet Goss had been stranded at the ranch for 2 days because she had come out to help, and then the road had become impassable. Adelaide privately thought this was Harriet's plan all along, and loved her for it. The girl, small and strong and furious about the whole enterprise of being born, which suggested she was going to do very well. They named Clara Ann, the Clara for Jacob's mother, who he had lost so young, and the Ann for Adelaide's, who deserved to be remembered. Clara Merritt arrived in the world with a full complement of opinions, and a pair of eyes that would eventually be Jacob's warm brown, though they were still working out the details in the first weeks. Thomas, presented with his sister for the first time, studied her with the intense evaluating expression he brought to everything new, and then pronounced her very small, which was accurate, and then asked if she could come outside with him, which was not yet feasible, and then accepted this information and went back to his usual activities. Adelaide and Jacob exchanged a look over his head that said they were going to be just fine. 1884 rolled into 1885, and the children grew, and the ranch grew, and the school grew, and the town of Cutter's Creek continued its slow expansion, a proper telegraph line eventually reaching them and making the world feel both smaller and somehow larger. Adelaide served on the school board herself by 1885, the first woman to do so, which had required a community meeting and a vote, and a great deal of persuasion, and the very public support of Jacob Merritt and Harriet Goss, and a sufficient number of the Valley's family men to tip the balance. Thomas Aldrich, whose opinion on most things Adelaide had long since stopped adjusting herself to accommodate, was not happy about it and said so in the meeting, and Adelaide thanked him for his candor and was elected anyway. It was a small victory in the long accounting of such things, and she knew it, and she did not pretend it was more than it was. There were women all over the territory working at the same kind of careful, persistent chipping away, and she was one of them, and the work was slow and sometimes exhausting and absolutely necessary. She told Jacob about the vote when she came home that evening, Thomas and Clara both already in bed, the house quiet in the way it got in the late evenings. She sat down at the kitchen table and he looked at her face and went and got 2 glasses and the small bottle of good whiskey he kept for special occasions. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened to the whole of it, the meeting, the vote, the faces of various men who had been opposed, the careful allies who had come through. When she had finished, he poured a small measure into each glass and pushed one across the table to her. "To Adelaide Merritt," he said, "who has never once stopped." She looked at him across the table, this man she had been building a life with for 7 years now, and felt the full weight of it, not heavy, just real and solid and present, the way the most important things feel. "To Jacob Merritt," she said, "who always stayed out of the way when I needed him to and never stayed out of it when I needed him not to, which is the most useful thing anyone has ever done for me." He smiled. They drank. By 1887, Clara was 3 and Thomas was 6 and beginning his first year of formal school, which meant he was in his mother's classroom, which was its own interesting domestic negotiation. Adelaide had strict and clear rules about the boundary between mother and teacher at school, and Thomas earnest, serious. His father's son in many ways understood them better than she had expected. He called her Miss Carver in the classroom, which initially made some of the other students giggle and then stopped being remarkable within a week. He was also, she noted with a particular quiet pride, an excellent student. Jacob occasionally rode with her and the children to town on school mornings, dropping them at the schoolhouse before continuing to whatever business had brought him in. And on those mornings, she watched him lift Thomas and Clara down from the horse with the unhurried care he brought to everything he cared about. And she thought about the day she had walked into Cutter's Creek with dust on her boots and her hair falling down and a canvas bag on her shoulder and nothing much else. And could not quite connect that person to this life, except that she knew the thread that ran through it. She had built this. She had chosen it deliberately when she could have gone anywhere else. And it had chosen her back. In the fall of 1888, Harriet Goss came to dinner at the ranch and brought news that the territorial government was moving toward seeking statehood, which eventually Wyoming would achieve in 1890, and with it, uniquely, remarkably, historically, the continued right of women to vote, which the territory had granted in 1869, and which Adelaide had lived with and depended on and been grateful for ever since. The conversation at the dinner table that night ran for 3 hours, into the kind of territory that both she and Jacob found endlessly interesting, the nature of what rights were and who decided, and the slow, uneven, incomplete progress of justice as a human project. Clara fell asleep in her chair. Thomas, 7 now and ferociously awake, held out until nearly 9 o'clock and then collapsed mid-sentence asking a question about the legislature. Jacob carried him up to bed while Adelaide helped Harriet with her coat, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, the older woman and the younger, in the good light from the house. "You are happy," Harriet said. It was not a question. "Yes," Adelaide said, "I am." "I knew you would be," Harriet said comfortably. "From the day you walked into my store, I thought that woman is going to find her feet here if she will just let herself." "You said nothing of the sort to me," Adelaide said. "No," Harriet agreed. "But I thought it." She went out into the November evening toward her horse, and Adelaide stood in the warm doorway and watched her go. Jacob came back downstairs and found her still standing there looking out at the night. "Come inside," he said. "It is cold." She turned around and let him close the door. The house was warm and lamplit, and the children were asleep upstairs, and the fire was going steadily in the stone fireplace, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and full of stars. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day I arrived." "What about it?" "About how much I did not know," she said, "about what was here." He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, just resting them there. "You could not have known," he said. "No," she said, "but I found it anyway." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, that simple gesture that still, 10 years into knowing him, made something settle in her. "You did," he said. "You walked in here with nothing and built everything." "We built it," she said. "You were here first. But you made it worth building toward," he said quietly. "Before you came I was doing it, but I wasn't," he paused, choosing. "I wasn't sure what it was for. You gave it a shape." She turned to face him. "You told me the cabin was small," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I did. And I told you I had lived in smaller." "You did. And you said stay." "I did," he said, and his voice had that quality it got when something mattered very much to him, that certain quiet. "Best thing you ever said to me," she said. He laughed, low and warm, and pulled her closer. "Best thing you ever answered." 1890 came, and with it Wyoming statehood, which Adelaide marked by taking her students through an entire week of civics. The history of the territory, the structure of state government, and yes, the right of women to vote, which she taught without apology and with the full historical record to back her up. Thomas Aldrich, who had retired from the school board by this point, heard about the lesson plan through the inevitable channels of small-town communication and had nothing to say that reached her ears. The new school board, half of which Adelaide had helped elect, was fully supportive. Thomas was now 10 and Clara was 6, and the school had a third teacher now, a steady man named Harris, and a proper second building. The Merritt ranch had grown again, the herd substantial, the land improved with each passing year, and 2 new families had settled on land adjacent to theirs, which made the valley feel populated in a way that was different from the solitary early years. In the spring of 1890, Adelaide discovered she was expecting their third child, which surprised them both somewhat given that they had thought their family was complete, and then surprised them both with how right it felt. She told Jacob on a Sunday morning in the garden she had planted along the south side of the house, a proper kitchen garden that she had expanded every year, which produced a quantity of vegetables that she and Jacob and Francis Webb's replacement, a ranch hand named Dolan, spent several autumn days putting up for the winter. "Another one," Jacob said, and he was smiling with his whole face in a way that she did not see him direct at anything except her and their children. "Apparently so," she said. "You are all right. I am very all right," she said. "I am 40 now, so I am watching myself carefully, but I am all right. I will take that as a promise," he said. He was 39, 2 years older than she was. She had been 26 when she arrived in this town, and he had been 31, and now they were these people, with these children and this land and this life, and the accumulation of it was not a weight but a richness. The third child arrived in November of 1890, another boy, and they named him Samuel, which was Jacob's father's name, and which Jacob had been quietly carrying around as a possibility for a long time. Samuel was a large, calm baby who regarded the world with a serenity that neither of his older siblings had displayed in infancy, and Thomas and Clara received him with what could only be called cautious approval, Thomas asking practical logistical questions, and Clara immediately attempting to hold him, which she managed adequately under supervision. Jacob sat in the chair by the bedroom window with Samuel in his arms while Adelaide rested, and Thomas and Clara crowded around, and Adelaide watched them from the bed with the afternoon light on all of them and thought that this was the picture she would keep, this particular arrangement of light and people, if she could keep only one. The years that followed Samuel's arrival were, in Adelaide's private assessment, the fullest she had ever known. Not the easiest. Thomas at 11 was in the particular difficult stretch between childhood and adolescence that tried everyone's patience including his own, and Clara at 7 was developing a stubbornness that was entirely recognizable to anyone who knew her parents, and Samuel was the easiest child in theory, and in practice occasionally managed to make everything very complicated. There were hard seasons financially, a bad cattle market year, a drought in the summer of 1892 that required careful management of the grazing, and there were the small personal losses that accumulated in any long life, neighbors who moved on or died, old friends grown distant. But there was also the deep, layered pleasure of a life that had been chosen and worked for and continued to be worth the choosing. There was the school, which Adelaide now considered the work of her life in the most fundamental sense. Not a job she held, but a thing she had built, and kept building, and sent out into the world in the form of young people who knew how to think and question and persist. There were the long evenings on the porch when the children were in bed, and the summer nights stretched long and she and Jacob sat with coffee or lemonade, and talked about everything and nothing, the way only people who know each other completely can talk. There was the way he still watched her face when she came home, as if the answer to some ongoing question was there, and always would be. In 1895, Thomas finished his schooling and began working the ranch properly alongside his father, and it was evident to everyone, including Adelaide and Jacob, that this was what he had been headed toward all along. He had his father's feel for the land, that particular attentiveness, and he came into the work with a seriousness that Jacob met without fanfare and enormous pride. Clara, by contrast, showed every sign of following Adelaide toward teaching, something Adelaide had not pushed for and was quietly delighted by. She was assisting in the classroom by 14, with Grace Potter, who was still there and had become indispensable, putting her to work on the younger students. Samuel was 5 in 1895, and spending his days in the particular absorbed and wandering way of very young children on a working ranch, following his father and brother at a safe distance, questioning everything about the natural world with a specificity that suggested he was going to be interested in plants and animals and the mechanisms of things for a long time. Jacob taught him the names of everything he could name and confessed freely when he did not know, and Adelaide found books about natural history in the Cheyenne Library and ordered them for him. One evening in the summer of 1895, she and Jacob were on the porch, the children ranging in their various directions across the property in the long evening light, and she had her lesson planning on her lap that she was not looking at, and he had his coffee, and the mountains were doing something extraordinary with the last of the day's light. "I was thinking," Jacob said. "What were you thinking?" "About something you said when you first came to the ranch, when I was building the east fence line." She tried to remember. "I said a great many things that day. You said that you thought staying was something you would have to find a reason for," he said. "The thing worth staying for." "I remember," she said quietly. "Did you find it?" She looked at him sideways in the golden evening light, this man she had been married to for 15 years, who she had spent 17 years knowing, who she still found entirely necessary. "Yes," she said. "You know I did." "I know," he said. "I just like to hear it." She laughed and reached over without looking and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers. Thomas came around the corner of the house, carrying something she was going to have to investigate, but not yet. Clara's voice was coming from the garden. Samuel was visible at the edge of the lower field, crouching over something in the grass with total concentration. The mountains were going from gold to rose to the particular blue of a Wyoming summer evening. "I like to say it," she said. "You stopped running." "You stopped running," she said, "a long time ago." "I was never the one who ran," he said gently. "No," she agreed. "You were the one who said stay." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which still fit exactly as it had always fit, and watched the light change on the mountains and listened to her children's voices in the evening air, and felt the particular, deep, unhurried satisfaction of a woman who had walked into a strange town with nothing, and through the accumulation of one right choice after another, the hard ones and the easy ones, and the ones she had not recognized as choices until later, had built herself a world. There had been other roads. She was old enough now and honest enough to know that. Different paths she could have taken at various forks, stayed in Colorado, tried her luck in another direction, been more afraid than brave at any number of critical moments. But this was the road she had taken, and it had led here, to this porch, to this man, to these mountains and this land and these children and this life, and she would not trade a foot of it for anything that any of those other roads might have offered. She had lived in smaller places than this. She had lived in harder ones, lonelier ones, places that had asked everything of her and given back very little. She had lived in those places and endured them and moved on, and eventually she had moved here to this valley, to this man who had looked at her with those steady eyes and seen something worth staying for in her at the same moment that she was beginning to see it in him. He had told her the cabin was small. She had said she had lived in smaller, and he had said stay, and she had, and it was everything. The years settled over the Merritt ranch like good soil, layered and generative, each one adding something to what had been built before. Thomas grew into a young man of integrity and capability, managing more of the ranch operations every year with a quiet competence that matched his father's. And in 1898, he brought home a young woman named Ruth from a ranch family in the next valley, and the house rang with a wedding for the second time. Clara, at 24, went to Cheyenne and enrolled in a proper teacher's college, and came back 2 years later with her certificate and her particular focused energy, and took over 2 of Adelaide's classes, freeing Adelaide to concentrate on the older students and on the school board work, which continued to be the ongoing process of slow improvement that it had always been. Samuel, who had spent his childhood studying everything, went east to Colorado to study at a proper school at 17, and came back at 22 with a degree in natural sciences and a collection of pressed plants and rock samples that took up an entire room, and a plan to study the Wyoming landscape systematically, which he did, eventually, with the methodical thoroughness that had always characterized him. Jacob and Adelaide in their 50s were different people than they had been in their late 20s and early 30s, as all people are slower in some ways, quicker in others, less concerned with what could not be changed and more attentive to what could be enjoyed. Jacob's dark hair had gone gray at the temples and then mostly gray all over, and he wore it the way he wore most things, without vanity or apology. Adelaide's dark hair had done the same, and she had put away the mirror anxiety of youth somewhere in her late 40s and found she did not miss it. They were in good health, both of them, which they credited to the outdoor life and the hard work, and they still walked the east fence line in the evenings when the weather was good, and they still sat on the porch and watched the mountains, and they still talked the way they always had, about everything worth talking about. In the summer of 1900, Thomas and Ruth presented them with their first grandchild, a boy they named Jacob Francis Jacob for his grandfather and Francis for old Francis Webb, whose name Thomas had grown up hearing as the name of a man worth remembering. Adelaide sat with the baby in the chair by the east bedroom window where she had sat with her own babies, in the room that had been Thomas's room and was now his again, and Jacob stood in the doorway and looked at her with the baby, and his expression was the same one he had worn when she told him she was expecting Thomas, 30 years ago, that open, unguarded warmth that she had spent her whole married life being the recipient of, and had never stopped being moved by. "Hello, Jacob Francis," she said to the baby, who was looking at the light coming through the window with Samuel's inherited expression of total focused attention. "Welcome to the ranch." Thomas came and stood beside his father in the doorway, this son of theirs who was now 30 years old and a father himself, and the two of them filled the doorway in a way that was very familiar, the same height, the same set of the shoulders, the continuity of it visible and solid. "Thank you, Mama," Thomas said. "For what?" she said. "For all of it," he said simply. She looked at him and then at Jacob and then back at the baby in her arms. Outside the window, the mountains were doing what they always did, being enormous and permanent and beautiful in their complete indifference to the scale of human lives, and she thought that this was all right, this indifference, because the human lives had their own scale and their own permanence in a different register. In the children grown and the school built, and the students sent out into the world and the land worked and improved and passed along. She thought about the road from the broken wagon outside Cutter's Creek, the road she had walked into town with dust on her boots and hope in her chest, and a letter in her canvas bag about a teaching position. She thought about Harriet Goss's sharp eyes over the bolt of fabric. She thought about nearly walking into Jacob Merritt outside the general store, and his hand catching her elbow before she fell, and the careful accumulation of conversations after. She thought about the cabin, which was not a cabin anymore, which had become this house, these rooms, this porch, all built and added and expanded over the years, the way lives are built when they are lived fully, not all at once but steadily, one room at a time. She thought about what he had said and what she had said and what he had said after. Stay. She had stayed. She had stayed, and this was what staying looked like. This morning light on a baby's face in a room that had been built for her by the man she loved, in a valley she had made her home, in a life she had chosen with everything she had. She pressed her lips to Jacob Merritt's small, perfect forehead and held him close, and let the morning come in through the window, and was, entirely and without reservation, at home.